We're going to now move to a Q&A session that will feature John Glier, as well as Suzanne Hilser-Wiles, Melinda Church, and Pete Lasher of Grenzebach, Glier & Associates. As a reminder, please pose your questions through the Q&A function of our Zoom client, and we hope to address as many of these questions as we can in the time that we have. But our first question is for John. John, one of our participants says, we have an outstanding ask to a principal gift donor. What tips or strategies do you recommend for continuing to communicate with that donor during this period to keep this current ask top of mind, but also not push too hard given the current economic climate?
Well, I think Melanie gave us a good clue to this, and I think it's very much stay in touch, be guided by the pace that your donor sets. But now is not the time to go dark. It is the time to stay connected, to stay engaged. It's, I think, by all means important to stay aware and be empathetic to that donor's particular circumstances, who they are, where they live, what their challenges, what their family challenges might be, and to allow them to really set the pace for moving forward with a solicitation. There are quite a few donors out there that are quite willing to stay in a discussion about a big gift. And there's certainly others who are absolutely shaken by this volatility in the capital markets, the disease that is enveloping us. And I think you've got to practice the same business discipline that we always would, that, as Melanie said, you ask permission first. You don't move forward with any kind of discussion without that donor being firmly complicit in it. Any solicitation, much less a transformational one, should be always approached as a dialogue and not as a transaction. And that's just simply understanding to what extent the donor needs to be a full partner in the process of discussing a big gift. This kind of environment we've never seen before. It's not just simply economic. There are many, many different human issues that surround us right now that make us nervous about what's going on and challenge us with respect to the typical disciplines and activities of our business and philanthropy. I think we need to be mindful of them at every level, including the highest level. I do think that we're going to have some donors out there that believe that if we continue to solicit, we're tone deaf. There are others who, in fact, think that even more so, they need to talk about philanthropic support of our institutions, and in some cases will pivot, will refocus their support on the kinds of immediate needs that they see emerging across our institutions, from economic needs of operating to the specific needs of needy students, of staff who are all of a sudden not at work anymore. So I think there's lots we need to think about in terms of big donors, and most of all, just be sensitive to the environment we all are operating in right now.
Thanks, John. I'm going to direct the next question we have to Suzanne Hilser-Wiles, president here at GG+A. It seems to be coming from a museum client or a museum institution. What effective virtual strategies have you seen to continue to engage our constituents when they cannot physically visit our institution?
First, I want to say thanks to everybody for the questions. As Mark alluded to, we've gotten lots and lots of questions during our first half hour. And while we won't be able to address them all, we are certainly going to start to address them in all of the thought leadership that the firm is doing. So if you don't hear an answer today, don't give up on us. Thank you all for writing in. As several of our speakers today have talked about, really first and foremost, it's staying in touch. That's our first piece of advice. Use the phone, use FaceTime, use Zoom. Your donors want to hear from you. The terrific work that your major gifts officers have done building those relationships mean that now you're part of that donors community and you're part of who they want to hear from in this time. But in terms of specific things to do, and I'm going to call on a few client examples for you, but I'm going to quote my colleague Melinda Church, who she wrote a terrific piece earlier this week about donor communications. If you're not one of the hundreds and hundreds of people who downloaded it this week, check out our website, and Melinda and I both have it up on LinkedIn. But Melinda's first piece of advice was to double down on mission. So how can you interact with people that reminds them of the important mission of your organization? And I'll give you a few examples, two examples of that. First is, a lot of our museum clients have done a terrific job of creating virtual experiences. Our client, the Art Institute, is very easy to find the virtual tour of the museum. And I think people appreciate the chance to be able to visit the Art Institute even when they can't go through the doors, especially those people who are not here in Chicago. Second, we have a number of our university clients who are thinking about how they can incorporate their alumni, parents, friends in their virtual learning. Cornell University does a class actually on the history of the university. They turned it into a Facebook event. It happens weekly on, I think, Tuesday evening, and they invite members of their Facebook community to participate. The university president does the lecture he would give, but lots of people get to revisit a class they either loved at Cornell or learn more about Cornell. And again, it helps people feel part of a community, part of and reminds them of what makes, in their case, Cornell special. Finally, I would say we have a few institutions that we've seen doing some really fun things around how do we build community during this time. We have a number of client institutions who are very sad that March Madness is not happening, a few that are a little relieved March Madness isn't happening for their team. And some of those institutions are creating watch parties around maybe national championships that they did win or rivalry games that they were successful at. We also have a client that was supposed to go for the first time to the Division I Sweet 16 with their basketball team. They have donors and student athletes who are really disappointed. They're encouraging their athletics donors to actually send notes to the student athletes talking about how proud they are of the team, showing themselves in gear for the team. So there are lots of ways that you can reinforce we're still a community, and that continues even if we can't see each other, even if we have to cancel things like opening nights or alumni reunions.
Great. Now we have a question for Melinda Church of our Strategic Communications practice area regarding outreach to constituents. Melinda, the question is, do you have suggestions for how we might think about segmenting crisis communication for our different constituencies, whether they be alumni, whether they be donors, whether they be members?
Yeah, it's certainly, I would say always that segmenting is best. In truly emergent crises, it's not always a luxury you have. Before I really say anything, though, I just want to underscore how imperative it is that leaders and anyone who speaks on an institution's behalf demonstrate two things across all audiences: transparency and consistency. We cannot favor some groups with early information in a crisis. So transparency, consistency, and integrity of message. It is absolutely true, though, that different audiences need and want different kinds of information. Obvious example is, ticket holders for a performance that's been canceled versus musicians and staff of that organization and the general public. I will say, hearing Melanie Duval talk about communications was heartening, and what she noted about having some core messaging that's absolutely tied to mission that everybody can adhere to is absolutely the way to go. It's not too late. Encourage people to just understand what that core messaging is, and then as needed to tree off from that messages that different constituents need to hear.
Great. The next question is a question for Pete Lasher, Senior Vice President. Pete, I think you've got a fan. The question is, Pete's article was very helpful. Pete, what if our CEO, President, doesn't understand the importance of reaching out to our key donors at this time? I suspect out of fear of turning them off. What tips do you have on how to convey the importance of communicating to our CEO or President?
That's a great question. I'm thrilled that we're bringing so many people together for this conversation. So let me just add my feelings as well. I think the most important thing that I would say is that to that leader is that it's not about us right now. It's about them. And so let's help them to reframe it. I'll give you an example. Earlier this week, I was talking to a vice president who told me about trying to convince his president to call a venture capitalist in Texas, the president did not want to reach out to that donor because they actually had a solicitation in front of them, and he didn't want to talk about the gift, and so we helped him to frame it so that we were reaching out to see how his business was doing. And we weren't in the call. The president came back and relayed to the vice president that he was astonished at how well the call was received. And the way he described it was, the CEO started asking me my opinion on how he should communicate with his people. And the idea that the president had been spending time talking to his students and to his faculty, that he could offer some insights into how the CEO would speak to his people. And the point there, and I think the president really appreciated this, was that this is an opportunity for our leaders to build trust, to build confidence, and to ultimately, while in the short run, it's not going to be about that open solicitation. In the long run, it's about building that kind of capital that when the time comes to resume those conversations, that there'll be that much more of a foundation of trust to move that conversation along. The second example that I'll give that's where it's not about us is that just this morning I was talking to the president of a Jesuit institution, and he was relaying to me just how much the alumni of that institution felt they needed to connect back with their university, and he's a Jesuit himself, and how much they appreciated that external communication, because as the world around them is so uncertain, to be able to go back to those Jesuit foundations was so important to them. So it's a variation on this point that Melanie made around mission first, but I think that's something that we should consider. And then the last thing I'll say, and it goes again to this notion of it's not about us, is this idea of stewardship. And what I said in my piece was that one of the most important things we can help our leaders to do is to think about how have people made an impact on this institution, and are we as an institution reaching back? And one of my clients asked we did a survey for them, which I referenced in the article, where 75% of those of donors said that the institution did a nice job of thanking them for their gift, but only 45% said that they were demonstrating the impact of their gift. And that really sort of shook the president a little bit. And so he has really been pushing his deans and his program directors to reach out. And so as we think about asking our presidents to reach out and our leaders to reach out, is to put stewardship first. Let's go talk about stewarding that relationship, which again, I think helps to reframe it around what is in it for us. They must not want to talk to us, to let's focus on them and demonstrate that empathy that we really need our leaders to have.
Great, thanks, Pete. Here's a question related to management. Strategies for communicating to donors are important, but what have you seen in the field thus far relating to communicating with our internal teams now that we are all working or will be working remotely? How do we keep our team focused on goals and working cohesively together?
This is Suzanne, and I will jump in and answer that because we've been actually compiling some of the best practices that we're seeing across our clients. And I think there are a couple practical things they're doing, but then there are two kind of bigger picture things that I would mention. A lot of them are using Zoom meetings. As Melanie pointed out, we have a number of clients who, since we're a remote workforce, have been surprising to us that they're just all learning how to use tools like Zoom. We are seeing a lot of people asking for daily updates being sent to managers. What are you doing today? How did yesterday go? Mostly because this is such an evolving time. And then importantly, actually getting together as a team and setting weekly goals for the team and for the individuals, because it is a changing world and we want to be able to know each week that we are agreeing to what are the most important things and are we focusing on that. I would say two kind of bigger picture things. A question we are getting a lot right now, and we got today from a number of you, is how should metrics change during this time? You're a program that really manages to the metrics. I would say most of our clients are saying right now the most important metric is going to be reaching out and contacting, real person-to-person contact with your donors. How this actually shifts out to be, a difference in face-to-face versus remote, but an actual contact. People are going to evaluate over the next several weeks, but what we want to see is the kind of behaviors that we know drive deeper relationships. So if I were managing a team of gift officers, and as I work with my clients, that's what I tell them. Make sure that you're tracking those personal interactions, you're recording them in your database, and those are the kinds of things that we're going to be measuring because that's what we know is going to have an impact over the long haul. The other thing that we're seeing is because this situation is evolving day to day, that teams are coming together in brainstorming calls around specific topics. Like, what are we hearing from donors about this? Are there things that donors are asking about that the university needs to do a better job of communicating? So coming up with some regular time that's information sharing with each other is also something that I think has been really effective, again, in reinforcing, as Melanie talked about, that your team is one team and you're here to support each other as well.
Let me just quickly add that I think we've seen a lot of different styles of engagement across remote teams. And some of you have been practicing remotely for a long time and are just really upping the ante on some of what you've already learned. But we've heard about teams who, in fact, gather every morning for 10 minutes, something like what Suzanne suggested, a stand-up meeting remotely, where the group and their manager gets together and says, here's our plan for the day. Here are the things we have in mind. Here are the kinds of things that we're going to be doing. And there are some teams who even come back at the end of the day and quickly convene and say, here's what we got done. But the point is, wherever you are and however your programs extend, build communities of practice right now. Build behaviors and share with one another the kinds of things that you're learning around your individual constituencies. Stay absolutely focused on the goals you have, but as Suzanne said, some things become more important right now. Those activity targets and your metrics are without question important. To stay engaged, to stay connected. It may not be the right time to solicit some of these prospects, even though they were approaching solicitation stage. It is a moment to step back and think hard about what they're experiencing, to be empathetic about their lives, and to be mindful that there's a lot of panic in the air right now. Not just economic panic, but serious panic about this disease and how it will impact every family out there. So as we manage the situation, I think we need to be mindful to put into place structures to sustain communication across your teams and to sustain the learning process. There's just no question that feeling together as a group is going to matter as people stay productive and frankly active in what is a really difficult set of circumstances.
We have another question that's come in from the audience that I'm going to pose to the group. Melinda, this might be more up your alley, but the question is, how might an organization think about the mix of messaging, particularly the fundraising messaging mix, in an environment in which the organization is largely communicating emergency health information?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm curious about the sender and the organization that he or she works for to really be able to get at the nature of the question. If it's a daily, can you say who the sender works for? Is that possible?
It's coming up as an anonymous attendee.
Well,
so Melinda, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that it's one thing if it's kind of, they are a health organization,
right,
and they're sharing that information with the public. I mean, what we've been talking to our clients about who are not engaged in sort of the health updates that they as an institution need to give to people, if it's really like a university, for instance, we've just been asked them to be thoughtful about the cadence of communication. What are the messages that need to really cut through and are critical for instance, students and parents, versus what do we want to tell the community about how we're responding? Right. So thinking about the messaging and the tone and the cadence of communication, I think, is really critical.
And this is John. And Melinda, go back to your original statements about transparency and authenticity. Remember, nonprofits across our communities are organizations of trust. And we need to continue to be leaders in the community wherever we are, and to tell and to share with our constituencies and communities what's going on, and to share as much as we possibly can about the circumstances that surround our healthcare institutions and the health realities of our communities. So being direct and responsive is more important than anything, as the kinds of institutions that we all are, and the service that we deliver to communities.
Great. Everyone, thank you for joining us. We're now out of time. We here at GG+A, of course, extend our thanks to all of you for joining us today, and also to all of our panelists and to our special guest, Melanie Duvall. We trust this has been enlightening and valuable to you in your work.
Go ahead.
Please join us for our next programming in our series, Fundraising in a Public Health Crisis, on Monday, March 23rd at 12 o'clock noon Central. We'll have a webinar, Fundraising Tips for Arts and Culture Institutions, Navigating the Economic Impact of COVID-19. Please look for information on registration in an email from our team that will immediately follow this webinar. We also welcome you to review our thought leadership written by our expert consultants. First, a piece by Suzanne Hilser-Wiles featured in the Chronicle of Philanthropy, 4 Ways to Engage Major Donors During the COVID-19 Crisis, as well as a piece by Melinda Church, Donor Communications in a Time of Coronavirus, and finally a piece by Pete Lasher, Nonprofit Executives Can Help Us Make Sense of This Uncertain Moment. Again, we thank you for joining us for this webinar, and we wish you all the very best. Have a great afternoon and a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.